Hey, recently I've had a bunch of requests for people about programming with the virus synthesizer. So I'm going to look at one aspect of programming this time, which is the modulation matrix. To me, the modulation matrix on the Access Virus synth line is one of the things that makes it the most distinctive, the most unique. If you look at the virus synth, there's the ADSR, the envelopes. They're really basic. A lot of other synthesizers out there have better envelopes than the virus. The filters are great, the oscillators are great, there's a lot of different types of waveforms and stuff, but the modulation matrix is really complex, really powerful, and a big part of how people get great sounds. This time, I just want to look at the modulation matrix, give you a basic insight into how to use it. There are some other really great videos out there. I think LFO Store has done one on some tips and tricks for virus synths, specifically the modulation matrix, and I'd highly recommend that. I'll put a link to that video in the description in this one because it's a lot more complex and kind of power user stuff. What I'm going to give you is basic stuff, because some people don't really fully understand the complexities. So I want to kind of simplify it, demystify it, and show you how powerful it is at the same time. The first thing you need to keep in mind is there are 6 modulation slots. Those modulation slots, you can use none of them, you can use all 6 of them. Within those, you have sources, amounts, and destinations. That's the basics of it. There are 39 different sources, and I mean they can be anything from a foot controller, a MIDI control, velocity, LFO, envelope, all sorts of things. How much you affect with those sources can be set in a negative or a positive value. And then we have the destinations. There are 120 different destinations for modulation. And it's not just standard destinations like volume, frequency, like cutoff. It can be really interesting and unusual things. For instance, one of the destinations could be the reverb time or the amount of a distortion pedal that gets integrated into that sound. Or it could be the amount of that modulation source that feeds into one of the other 6 slots. So you can get very, very complex with this, which is why people get such crazily different, interesting, and unusual sounds out of the virus. But once again, for this video, I'm going to keep it simple. I want you to understand the building blocks, the basics of how this works, so that you can go yourself and decide how you want to apply that to create the kind of sounds that you're looking for. In this video, we're just going to look at programming from the front panel of the virus synth. A lot of people do that. Now, personally, I would highly recommend using on-screen editing software to do any of your programming on a virus. It is way more intuitive, way quicker. And when I show you the options for doing this online, I think you'll immediately understand how powerful that is. For this video, we're just going to use knobs on the front panel. If you want to edit on a computer, there are 2 options. There's the free option, which is made by Access Virus. It's called Virus Control, and you get it for free from the virus website. Now, unfortunately, they haven't been updating it for the last few years, so you can't use it with the newest Mac operating systems. That really sucks. The other company is Mystery Islands Music, and they make something called the Virus HC Editor. Really powerful, even better than the Access Control software, actually, in a lot of ways. But it's a little finicky to get it working right. It's a little more complex. It ranges between about $50 and $80, depending on when you buy it. They do have sales quite regularly, and I think when it first came out, it was many times that. So if you're going to do any programming on a virus, I'd highly recommend one of those options. For the video today, I'm just going to be using the hardware to do the programming. So you have modulation section, and then you have these 3 soft knobs. These are what's used for doing all the programming of all these parameters. The reason that I like to start with an initialized patch is there's no programming, no effects. You're only going to hear what you are doing to the sound. There's nothing pre-existing. We have a very basic sound there. Here's where we interact with the virus with these 3 knobs. Slot number 1. It's the one that's blinking up here. On the left are all the sources. Now, as I said, there are 39 sources. And the drag with doing it from the hardware is you can only see one of them at a time as you rotate this encoder. When you do it on the computer, you can actually see a list of all your sources, all your destinations, all 6 modulation slots at once. So you really get an overview of what's happening. Here, you can select one modulation source or another, but you don't have an actual list in front of you of what's available. Same thing for the destinations. With 120 destinations, it's hard to remember all of them and where they are. So editing on a screen, on a computer, way more efficient. But let's just stick to what we've got here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with the LFO1 as a modulation source. It's the most common thing that you hear on synthesizers is an LFO modulating pitch or amplitude or something. So we're going to start there. LFO1, and then for our destination, going to go to oscillator 1 pitch. Now, I can use these increment, decrement buttons. So this is the amount. So we know this is LFO1. So we go to LFO1 right here, and it tells us the speed. There are 2 ways to set the speed, either with a clock value or with an actual number. Now, the reason that a lot of clock value things happen is if you want to have things timed to your sequencer, beats per minute, you want to have any of this modulation synced to a master clock with your DAW, for instance. For now, we're just going to use an actual rate. Here we can pick the waveform shape. I can scroll by hand, or I can go one at a time with this value button. Sine wave, triangle, sawtooth, square wave, sample and hold, which is random. And then you go through some of the other waveforms there are loads of them in here. So if you listen, it does sound erratic, but it's actually a repeating cycle. Okay, so let's go back to something simple. This is the amount we're modulating. And we can go in a negative value. Very subtle modulation. Now, typically with an LFO, you'd have it fast, and you might use it as vibrato or something. But let's take a look. What if we apply that to something different? Let's say we change it to the waveform. Now I'm going to slow this LFO down. So this is going through a whole bunch of different waveforms, selecting them one at a time. And now if we bring in oscillator 2, all of a sudden you've got something kind of interesting happening there. And all you've done is one little modulation. Now I'm going to select it to panorama. So now that LFO is going to affect panning back and forth in the stereo field. Now we're sending that same sine wave, LFO, to the EQ mid-range gain. Here's something interesting. I'm now sending that same modulation source to the distortion intensity. So you can see there's all sorts of different destinations that could be really useful. And you can set it to things like the attack, the decay, arpeggiator note length, arpeggiator pattern. So these are really unusual destinations compared to what a lot of synths offer. Chorus delay, the delay coloration of the digital delay, delay feedback, delay modulation depth. So some really interesting destinations here. And of course, I'm just using a simple sine wave, but we could use almost anything as a modulation source. It could be a foot pedal, it could be velocity, it could be the output of another LFO, it could be the envelope. So here's something. I've got two oscillators going. This is what I've got going for oscillator 2. And this is oscillator 1. Now I'm going to use this LFO to go back and forth between them. And if I speed up that LFO, that's kind of interesting already. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking that same sine wave and I'm applying it to oscillator 2 detune. The interesting thing is regular oscillator detune is cool, but it's consistent. And this way I'm modulating it, so it's changing over time. And now what gets really interesting is if we take LFO 1 and decide not to use a sine wave, but use something much more complex. Now I'm using one of these more unusual waveforms to modulate the pitch of oscillator 2. Not too useful, but if we change that to the wave selection, you really get a sense of how random that can become. If we take that same modulation and we apply that to the panning, if we take that same modulation and we apply it to the mix of the chorus, just listen how unusual this is. Now in slot 1, I actually have 3 different modulation capabilities just within that one slot, and there are 6 slots. So I'm just going to step down to number 2. It uses the same modulation source, which is an LFO in this case, but we can go by a different amount to a different destination. So I'm just going to apply a couple of different destinations here of the same LFO, add a third destination, and you see how interesting that simple note got so quickly. So you can see by taking an unusual waveform and using that as a source, you can get a lot of randomness really quickly. Let's change LFO 1 to a square wave. Very easy to hear what's going on there. Going to apply LFO 1, a square wave now, to the panorama. I'm just going to modulate the pitch of oscillator 1 with this sample and hold, this random. The reason I recommend you do that is if you use pitch, it's really easy to hear what that modulation source is doing before you apply it to something else, because this is always going to be the most sonically evident. Now, if I apply this to panorama, you understand what it's doing. Let's put a little bit of delay on this sound. Now we're going to apply this random sample and hold to some of the delay parameters. So you see how so quickly you can get a bunch of random stuff happening, and we've hardly even started to do any modulating. Going to add a different destination at the same time. Now don't forget, we have 6 different slots here. Each of the slots, the one thing they have in common is slot 1 can only have one source. You can pick sources like a breath controller, any MIDI number, balance, expression pedal, amplitude, velocity, envelopes, obviously the LFOs, key following, key tracking. So now I have set LFO2 to the patch volume like all the oscillators. Now it's sweeping the wavetables. The main thing we're manipulating here is the delay and the tuning of one of the oscillators, but you can hear how radical and random it gets. And in slot 2, the wave select. And this is something kind of fun. We can take LFO2 and apply it to slot 1 amount number 1. So we're actually modulating the first modulation setup we did. So we're modulating one modulation slot with another LFO. Now for a second, I'm going to turn everything in slot 1 off. I'm going to go to slot 2. I'm using this source called random to manipulate oscillator 1's pitch. Now the thing that makes this different than an LFO with sample and hold, which is random as well, is this is just random per keystroke. So every time I hit a key, it comes up as a different pitch. And the higher the value, the more variation in the pitch range there is. So that's really interesting because it's not an LFO. As soon as I hit a note and hold it, nothing happens. It's only per keystroke. So if I had this at a very minimal setting, and I bring in another oscillator that isn't changing, it's really an interesting idea. And of course, you can apply this random thing per note on to any of these 120 destinations. Anyway, that's just kind of a basic overview, but the idea is you've got your modulation sources and 6 slots, and in each of the 6 slots, you can have 3 different destinations affected by different amounts. There are some things I would really like to have seen changed. It'd be nice to be able to mute each slot. If you're working on different modulation slots, it's kind of nice to be able to mute some of them so you can just hear what you're working on at the time. Once again, I would highly recommend, if you're going to do any of this sort of editing, you do it on a screen. Here's one of the reasons. I can step through these, but as soon as I go to another knob to activate it, it moves it from the original state. Not ideal. And you got to remember that there are 120 different destinations, so that's a lot of subtlety. Much better to edit on a screen where you can actually look at a whole list of destinations and just click on one instead of hunting to see where it is, what's available. Anyway, that's the basics of the modulation matrix on the Access Virus synth line. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it answered some of your questions, and we'll see you next time.